Hello and welcome to today's lesson where we're looking at Trompenaars' 7 cultural dimensions, also known as the 7 dimensions of culture. Now, business is becoming ever more global, and as a result of this, teams are becoming more diverse. So you're likely to need to work with people from other cultures and other countries. Now, most of the time, things will go well when you do this, but when things don't and misunderstandings arise, then Trompenaars' cultural dimensions model can help. Now, the model works by differentiating cultures based on their preferences in the 7 dimensions you can see here. So we have Universalism versus Particularism, Individualism versus communitarianism, specific versus diffuse, neutral versus affective, achievement versus ascription, sequential time versus synchronous time, and finally internal direction versus external direction. Now, the big thing to know about this model is that it won't help you learn cultural etiquette, but its real advantage is that it helps you step outside of your own biases and your own stereotypes. And in doing that, you can see how another culture might approach a problem. And that can then prompt you with ideas to resolve any misunderstanding. So let's take a look at each of the dimensions in turn. So first we have Universalism versus Particularism. Now, this dimension can be summarized by asking what matters more, rules or relationships. Cultures based on universalism try to treat all cases the same, even if they involve friends or loved ones. So the focus is more on the rules than the relationship. Universalist cultures include Canada, the US, the UK, and Australia, for example. Alternatively, cultures based on particularism will find relationships more important than rules. You can bend the rules for family members, close friends, or important people. Each case has to be examined in the light of its special merits. And particularist cultures include Latin America, Korea, China, and Russia, for example. Now, some tips for working with universalist cultures. So firstly, keep your promises, be consistent, and finally, explain the logic behind why you have made a certain decision. And some tips for working with particularist cultures. So invest in building relationships so that you can understand the particular needs of others. Secondly, respect people's needs as much as possible in your decision making. And finally, take the time to call out specific, important rules that must be followed. So the next dimension is individualism versus communitarianism. And this dimension can be summarized by asking, do you work as a team or as an individual? Now, do people desire recognition for their individual achievements, or do they want to belong to a group? Individualistic cultures believe that your outcomes in life are the result of your choices. And in these cultures, decision makers make decisions and they don't need to consult others to do so. So thus, decision makers can make decisions at speed. And in these cultures, it's your responsibility to look after your own happiness and fulfillment. These type of cultures include countries like Canada, the US, the UK. Alternatively, cultures based on communitarianism believe your quality of life is better when we help each other. So thus, these cultures organize themselves around groups. There's a strong sense of loyalty within the group. And as a result of this group tendency, decision-making is slower as everybody gives input. Job turnover will be lower though, because there's high group loyalty. And finally, the group gets rewarded for high performance rather than the individual. Communitarian cultures include countries like Japan, much of Africa, China, and Latin America. So some tips for working with individualistic cultures. So firstly, reward and issue praise based on a person's individual performance. Secondly, encourage people to use their own initiative. And finally, align the individual's need with those of the organization. And some tips for working with communitarian cultures. So firstly, reward the group for high performance. Secondly, praise the group in public, but praise individuals for their contribution in private. And finally, try to include the whole team in the decision-making process. The third dimension is specific versus diffuse. And this dimension can be summarized by asking, how separate is your personal and professional life? In specific culture, people tend to keep their personal and work life separate. So these cultures don't see overlap between the two spheres, and they tend to be schedule focused and direct and to the point in their communications. They focus more on the goal than on the relationship. So examples of these types of cultures include Germany, the Netherlands, the US. Now, alternatively, we have diffusive culture, and here people tend to see their work life and personal life as interconnected. And these cultures believe that objectives can be better achieved when relationships are strong. So as such, in these cultures, work colleagues socialize with each other outside of work more. These cultures are courteous and respect age, status, and background more. So examples include China, India, Argentina, and Spain. So some tips for working with specific cultures. So firstly, create agendas for your meetings. Secondly, stick to your agenda as best you can. And thirdly, focus first on setting objectives for people. And secondly, on your relationships. And some tips for working with diffusive cultures. Build your relationships before you start setting objectives. Secondly, expect invitations to more social occasions from colleagues and commit to attending them. And finally, expect to discuss business in social situations and personal matters inside of the workplace. So the fourth dimension is neutral versus affective. And this dimension can be simply summarized by asking, do you show your emotions? Now, in a neutral culture, people tend not to share their emotions. Emotions are, of course, felt by the individual, but they're kept in check and controlled. Observing these people, you would consider them cool and rational. Neutral cultures include Germany, the Netherlands, the UK. Alternatively, we have affective culture, where people tend to share their emotions, even in the workplace. In an affective culture, it's considered normal that people share their emotions. So examples of these countries include Italy, Spain, and again, Latin America. So some tips for working with neutral cultures. Keep your emotions, both what you say and what your face says, in check. Secondly, remember that people are less likely to express their true emotions. So try to read between the lines. And thirdly, after initial chit-chat, stay on topic during meetings. And some tips for working with affective cultures. Use emotion to communicate what you want in your goals. Share how you feel to strengthen your workplace relationships. And finally, learn some specific techniques to diffuse situations where emotions are running really high. So the next dimension is achievement versus ascription. And this can be summarized by asking, do we prove ourselves to get status, or is status given to us? So in an achievement culture, you earn status through knowledge or skill. Job titles are earned and reflect this knowledge and skill. Anybody can challenge a decision if they have a logical argument. So examples of achievement cultures include the US, the UK, Scandinavian countries. Alternatively, in an ascription culture, you're given status based on who you are. This could be because of your social status, your education, or even your age. You earn respect in these cultures because of your commitment to the organization, not your abilities. So a decision will only be challenged by someone with a higher authority. So examples of ascription cultures include Japan, Italy, and France. Now, some tips for working with achievement cultures. So firstly, issue praise to an individual in front of their peers. Secondly, try to avoid using titles. And finally, reward individual performance. And some tips for working with ascription cultures too. Use titles to refer to peers. If you wish to challenge a decision of a superior, then you need to handle this really delicately. And finally, pay extra care to show respect to your superiors. Now, the next dimension is sequential time versus synchronous time. And this can be summarized by asking, do things get done one at a time, or do many things happen at once? In a sequential time culture, time is very important. People like projects to be completed in stages. Time is money, and so it's important that each stage is finished on time. It's rude to be late, or it's considered rude to be late for meetings. And examples of sequential time cultures include the US, the UK, and Germany. Now, in a synchronous time culture, then people see the past, the present, and the future as interwoven. And because of this, people do several things at once, as time is interchangeable. Now, this results in plans and deadlines being flexible. It also explains why punctuality is less important, and examples of synchronous time cultures include Japan, India, and Mexico. Now, some tips for working with sequential time cultures. Keep to deadlines and commitments. Try not to deviate from the set schedule, and remember to always show up on time to meetings. And some tips for working with synchronous time cultures: allow people some autonomy within the schedule you're trying to hit. Allow time for people to arrive late for meetings, and be explicit, calling out any deadlines that are not flexible and people really have to hit. So the final dimension is internal direction versus external direction, and this can be summarized by asking, do we control our environment or are we controlled by it? So in an internal direction culture, people believe that they can control their environment to achieve their goals. So the focus is selfish. It's about, oneself, one's team, and one's organization. Now, winning is important in these cultures, and aggressive personalities are thus prevalent. So examples of these cultures include the US, Australia, and the United Kingdom. Alternatively, in an external direction culture, people believe that they must work with their environment to achieve their goals. So in these cultures, winning isn't as important as maintaining strong relationships. They focus on environmental factors. So for example, making strong relationships to achieve their goals. So examples of these type of cultures include China, Russia, and even Saudi Arabia. So some tips for working with internal direction cultures. Allow people to set their own learning development plans. Allow a degree of constructive criticism. And make sure to set really clear goals and objectives. And some tips for working with external direction cultures. So rather than setting goals, give feedback so people can correct their course en route. And finally, allow people autonomy to use their relationships to achieve results. So we've just covered all of the 7 dimensions, but how do you actually use the model? Well, unfortunately, the model has no clear and consistent way to use it. But here's a very simple process you can use to start making use of the model. So first, self-evaluate that any misunderstanding is at its root caused by cultural differences, and you might want to use a tool like the 5 whys to do this. I'll include a link to that video that we have on that below this video. So secondly, you want to score the person, not the country they're from, against each of the 7 dimensions. And thirdly, you want to examine those dimensions with the biggest score. And from this, select the tips provided earlier in this video for that dimension to attempt to resolve the problem. Now note that there's a reason why we score the person and not the country they're from. And that's because within individual countries, there are cultural differences from one region to the next. So we score the individual to avoid overgeneralization. So in summary, most of the time when working with different cultures, things are going to go fine. But when they don't, then Trompenaars' cultural dimensions model, or the 7 dimensions of culture, can help you to understand why. And once you understand the root of the problem, then it's possible to generate ideas to resolve it. Now, the model won't help you learn cultural etiquette, but its real advantage is that it allows you to step outside of your own biases and stereotypes. And in doing that, you can see how another culture might approach a problem or might be approaching the problem you're facing. And that can then prompt you with ideas to resolve any misunderstanding that exists. So that's it for this lesson. Really hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.